Something is wrong here. Did it actually perform miracles? At first, that sounds like the kind of thing people would know. Either it did, or it did not. That is how we want it to sit. Clean. Simple. Solid enough to hold. And for a moment, it does feel that way. You hear the claim. You weigh it in your mind. And you expect it to stay in one place. You expect the answer to come into focus if you just look a little closer. But it does not stay there. Because the closer you get, the less it behaves like something that should be easy to settle. Not because it disappears. Not because it falls apart. If anything, it stays there too strongly. Too firmly. In a way it does not quite fit the neat answer you were ready to accept. So you start with the obvious response. Then you hesitate. Then you notice that the thing you thought would become clearer is somehow harder to place than it was at the beginning. And that leaves you back at the same point, only less comfortable than before. Did it actually perform miracles? The first question seems simple enough to settle in the chapel itself. If this cloth performed miracles, where are they? The linen hangs high and pale in the dim light, carrying a faint front figure and a matching back figure, as though a body had passed through it without folding the image around the sides. Below it, rows of candles burn steadily. Visitors kneel. The cloth is not shown as an object that healed the blind on contact, or stopped bleeding wounds in public view. Its force begins somewhere else, in what it appears to be. That appearance is unusually specific. Dark reddish marks sit at the wrists, the side, and both feet. The body is not a generic corpse, but one arranged around crucifixion injuries. A nearby black and white photograph sharpens the puzzle. On the linen, the face is washed out and vague. In the photograph, the features gather themselves into a more legible face, almost as if the cloth had stored a reverse tonal pattern before photography knew how to read it. That seems to offer a workable answer to the miracle question. Perhaps the miracle was not repeated intervention, but the creation of the image itself. A burial cloth marked in a way ordinary painting does not explain. At first glance, the surface cooperates with that idea. The body image looks faint, rather than painted on. No obvious brushwork announces itself from a distance. The front and back arrangement encourages a physical reading rather than an artistic one. If the cloth was revered for centuries, as the burial shroud of Jesus, then its miraculous status may have grown from visible traits that seem to exceed known craft. In that setting, the absence of reported wonderworking by the cloth becomes less troublesome. The object would be miraculous by origin, not by later performance. But that answer depends on what kind of object is hanging there. The chapel display does not show when the cloth first entered the historical record. The barrier, the candles, the devotional posture of the viewers, none of that dates the linen. The image may look ancient. Veneration can make anything feel older than its paperwork. If the cloth's public life begins much later than the burial it is said to record, then the miracle under investigation changes shape. Was the marvel in the event that formed the image, or in the later success of the object as a focus of belief? Even within the display, the evidence pulls in two directions. The stains suggest bodily trauma. The photograph suggests hidden image information. Yet the cloth's sacred reputation rests heavily on recognition. People see the wounds they expect from the Passion, then see a face emerge more clearly in photographic negative, then return to the wounds with greater confidence. That loop is powerful, but it is not the same as documenting supernatural effects caused by the cloth itself. So the question narrows. If no consensus of later miracles attaches to the linen, then the case stands or falls on the image. And once the image becomes the miracle candidate, another problem waits behind the chapel glass. What, exactly, is on the fibers that makes a photographed face appear stronger than the face visible to the eye? While the cloth still shows no clear paint? The question sounds simple when it is first attached to the cloth. If this is the burial shroud of Jesus, did it perform a miracle, or at least preserve one? The linen itself does not answer in words. It answers in surface behavior. Under magnification, the body image is not sunk into the threads like dye, and not built up on them like paint. The yellowed tone sits on the outermost fibrils of the linen bundle, as if only the skin of the threads changed. That immediately gives the image a different status. A painted relic can be revered. A surface alteration with no obvious pigment invites a different kind of claim. If no brush laid it down, what did? A larger image section on a monitor seems to help. The shading is mottled, thin, discontinuous. No directional strokes gather into contours. No pooled medium bridges fibers. The face on the cloth looks vague to the eye, but when converted from grayscale into relief data, the density values rise into a coherent three-dimensional form more readily than ordinary photographs usually do. That seems to offer a practical route toward miracle language. Not an artist's depiction, but some kind of physical transfer from a body. Then the cloth itself interrupts that comfort. Triangular burn holes from a later fire cut through the fabric. Broad water stains spread around them. The body image remains visible where it survives, but the damage does not behave like the source of the image. The burns char and puncture. The water blurs and darkens. Neither reproduces the pale, superficial body coloration. So heat damage and accident do not supply the mechanism. The image still sits there as a separate event. At that point, the strongest working explanation is almost irresistible. Perhaps the cloth recorded something that happened to a corpse in a way no workshop process normally does. Yet, the same microscope view that encourages that thought also narrows the problem. If the coloration affects only the top fibrils, how did a wrapped body produce a full-length image without the distortions expected from contact? Why are there gradations where pressure should have created sharper boundaries? Why does the image look more like encoded distance than compression? The relief rendering of the face deepens that pressure. If image density loosely tracks body to cloth distance, then the cloth is not merely stained. It is carrying spatial information, but a burial wrapping should touch some areas, gap over others, fold, crease, and collapse. A simple imprint ought to exaggerate contact points and lose the rest. The image instead remains strangely restrained, front and back, with no obvious side images and no heavy smearing where fabric would have shifted around the body. That leaves the miracle question in an awkward procedural state. The cloth does not show the ordinary signatures of painting. It does not borrow its image from the visible burns or water damage. Its surface chemistry appears unusually shallow. Its tonal values can be processed into shape. Each point makes the image feel less like devotional art, and more like an event residues. But an event residue of what kind? A miracle would answer the devotional question. It would not yet answer the physical one. The linen keeps forcing that distinction. The more the image resists brushwork, the more urgently the mechanism matters. And the more the mechanism matters, the less the word miracle functions as an explanation, and the more it behaves like a placeholder over a measurement problem, still sitting on the threads. The question sounds simple when asked in front of the cloth. If this is the burial shroud of Jesus, did it actually perform miracles? The room itself encourages that thought. The linen hangs high, the figure faint but complete, the wounds placed where devotion expects them. Yet the first hard interruption comes not from the chapel, but from a table of cuttings. Small linen samples sit in labeled containers beside a laboratory printout. The numbers are narrow enough to feel decisive. 1260 to 1390. If the cloth dates there, the miracle question changes shape immediately. A medieval object can still inspire healings, visions, vows, conversions. But that would make the cloth a focus of belief, not physical proof of resurrection. The dates seem to clear the fog. A relic famous for wonders becomes a product of the age when Europe displayed relics publicly and often competitively. The setting begins to agree. The cloth is documented in medieval France. In one record, it appears not in some hidden apostolic treasury, but in a church world of banners, processions, and Gothic stone. Nearby sits a parchment memorandum under glass, dense script beside a bishop's seal. Its accusation is blunt enough to feel practical rather than speculative. The cloth was said to be painted. That, too, seems to answer the miracle question. A painted cloth does not perform miracles. People perform belief around it. Then, the inventory pages are opened. Illuminated lists of relics survive from earlier Christian settings, careful enough to name bones, fragments, vessels, textiles. No securely dated 1st century burial cloth with a full body image appears among them. The silence is not theatrical. It is administrative. If such an object existed and circulated openly, where is it in the records that catalogued lesser things? The absence makes the bishop's memorandum feel less like local hostility and more like a surviving piece of a larger chronology. So the working picture becomes almost comfortable. A cloth emerges in the late Middle Ages, is displayed in France, is denounced by a bishop, and tests medieval by radiocarbon. In that arrangement, miracle stories belong to the history of veneration, not to the fabric itself. But the question does not stay there. If the cloth was simply a devotional fabrication, what exactly was being fabricated? The memorandum calls it painted, yet the surviving challenge in this step is not only the accusation, but the timing. The bishop's complaint exists because the cloth was already attracting attention, strong enough to require intervention. Why did this particular object gain that force so quickly? A routine painted relic should fit comfortably among many others. Instead, this one generated records, dispute, display, and repeated preservation. The dates still sit on the printout. The church setting still places it in medieval Europe. The inventories still do not carry it backward into secure antiquity. Yet the miracle question has narrowed rather than disappeared. Perhaps the cloth never did anything beyond gathering devotion. Perhaps every reported wonder happened in the minds and bodies of those who knelt before it. But if that is the whole account, why does the evidence trail begin not with a triumphant declaration of a new relic, but with a warning that was already convincing enough to need debunking? If the cloth itself performed miracles, the case ought to begin with effects, cures, interventions, events tied to contact. Instead, the investigation keeps returning to the surface of the linen. In the close-up photographs mounted on the lab wall, pale rings sit around the dark red stain areas like faint tides around islands. Those halos are reported as serum separation, the kind of boundary expected when real blood components spread and dry. That gives the cloth a different kind of force. Not miracle as public spectacle, but miracle as bodily tracing. Perhaps the cloth mattered because it touched an actual crucified body. That sounds workable for a moment. A forged relic could imitate wounds, but serum halos are harder to stage convincingly, especially before modern forensic language existed. Then the magnified border of one stain complicates the easy answer. In the cross-section image, the dark red material appears beneath the lighter yellow body image layer. If that ordering is correct, the blood was there first, and the body image came later. A painter making a devotional object would normally build a figure, and then add blood where needed. Here the sequence points the other way. So was there first a blood-marked cloth, and only afterward some separate image-forming event? The wound pattern presses that question harder. The figure shows marks at the wrists rather than the palms, a side wound, and blood trails angled down the forearms in a way often described as consistent with a suspended body. Those details are frequently treated as too anatomically specific for a casual medieval invention. If the cloth gained sacred status because it preserved accurate traces of crucifixion, then perhaps reports of miracles attached themselves to authenticity rather than proving it. The object would not need to emit power. It would only need to persuade generations that it had been present at the central miracle. But the surface keeps resisting that simplification too. Beside a board of bright pigment grains under magnification, the image area of the cloth shows only discolored linen fibers. No obvious paint particles, no brush-loaded accumulation, just yellowed fibrils. That seems to remove ordinary painting from the table and leaves a more unsettling question in its place. If not pigment, what made the image? A naturally discolored surface can still be old, without being miraculous. Dehydration, oxidation, heat, vapors. Each can color linen. Yet those processes do not automatically explain why the image remains so superficial, while the blood-like areas appear materially distinct, and that distinction matters for the miracle question. If the image and the stains formed by different mechanisms at different times, then the cloth may combine one set of traces from a body and another from an image event. That would preserve authenticity for some features while loosening it for others. A relic could be physically unusual without having done anything miraculous. On the other hand, if the blood came first, and if the image later appeared without pigment and without penetrating the threads, then the cloth's reputation did not arise from pious imagination alone. Something happened to the linen that still has to be described in physical terms. The difficulty is that none of these observations records a miracle directly. They record sequence, material behavior, and stubborn surface facts. The halos ask whether the stains are real blood residues. The layering asks what came first. The wound placement asks who understood crucifixion anatomy. The fiber discoloration asks how an image can exist without paint. The cloth remains powerful because each answer narrows one path and opens another. And the question, did it perform miracles, keeps sliding sideways into a harder one. What, exactly, happened on the fabric before anyone began calling it holy? The question sounds simple when it is first put beside the cloth. If this linen truly touched the body of Jesus, did it therefore perform miracles? The nearest evidence does not begin with cures or visions. It begins with a corner. In a side-by-side enlargement, that corner does not quite behave like the central cloth. The thread pattern looks tighter in places, the tone slightly different, as if one region had lived a different material life from the rest. That offers a practical answer to the dating problem. If the radiocarbon sample came from a repaired section, then the medieval date may belong only to the repair. The miracle claim, weakened by the laboratory range of 1260 to 1390, suddenly has room again. Not proof, but room. Under magnification, the corner becomes more troublesome in a useful way. Fine white cotton fibers appear among the flax threads from the sampled area. Cotton does not by itself make the cloth ancient, and it does not make it holy. But it does complicate the neatness of the tested sample. Why would a supposedly uniform linen relic contain mixed fibers in the very region cut for dating? A rewoven repair begins to sound less like special pleading, and more like a textile question. Then the cloth's damage enters the frame. Charred edges, smoke-darkened patches, stitched repairs from an old fire. These are not devotional impressions but physical interruptions. If heat, smoke, water, and centuries of handling altered the chemistry of the sampled threads, perhaps the date drifted younger and again, the explanation feels satisfyingly procedural. No miracle is needed to explain the date. No fraud is needed either. Just altered material in the wrong place. But the sample tubes remain sealed in a row beside photographs of the exact corner removed. And the confidence starts to thin for a different reason. The corner was documented. The cut location was not a rumor. If that region was visibly unusual, why was it selected? If it was not visibly unusual, how large would a repair have to be to change the date, yet remain uncertain under inspection? The question presses on the miracle issue from the side. A disputed date can reopen age, but age is not the same as supernatural action. And there the investigation catches on another edge. Even if the tested threads came from altered cloth, what miracle would the linen itself be said to have performed? The cloth bears wounds consistent with crucifixion. It carries an image still argued over. It has drawn centuries of veneration. None of those are the same as documented miraculous agency. The strongest rescue available here is narrower. Perhaps the cloth is older than the carbon result suggests. Perhaps old enough to matter historically. Yet the evidence doing that work is textile irregularity, fiber content, contamination pathways, repair geometry. That creates an awkward split in the object itself. The more persuasive the material case becomes against the sampled corner, the more the cloth looks like a damaged, repaired, handled artifact moving through ordinary history. And if ordinary history can explain the date dispute, what exactly remains for miracle to explain? The image, perhaps. The blood, perhaps. But not this corner, not these cotton fibers, not the smoke-darkened margins. So the investigation does not arrive at a miracle. It arrives at a narrower uncertainty. The date may not settle the cloth. The cloth, in turn, still does not settle what happened on it, or through it, or whether anything happened through it at all. If the cloth performed a miracle, The image on it should resist ordinary making. That is the pressure point in the room, where the comparison panels stand. On one side, a cloth has been pressed over a sculpted face. The result is immediate and familiar. Dark contact zones, stretched cheeks, a widened nose, distortion wherever fabric had to bend around form. Beside it, the full-length body image from the shroud remains oddly undistorted. The front figure and back figure reading more like a controlled projection than a wrapped contact transfer. For a moment, that seems useful. A simple body imprint should have warped. If it did not warp, perhaps the image was not made by touch at all. Then the pigment board enters the same frame. Red-brown coating on a test panel, magnified, breaks into clumps and large particles. The shroud fibers beside it show something else. Yellowed fibrils, bare of obvious paint grains. That appears to clear away the oldest accusation. Not a brush, not a painted icon, not a devotional fake in the ordinary workshop sense. If there is no pigment pattern and no contact distortion, miracle begins to feel less like piety and more like a physical category waiting for a name. But the laboratory chamber offers another route before that conclusion can settle in. Linen strips suspended above heated chemicals slowly turn straw yellow. The color sits near the surface. It is not a body image, not yet, but it is discoloration without paint. Oxidation, dehydration, vapor reactions. Suddenly, the image no longer needs a supernatural event to become superficial. A cloth can change color through chemistry alone. If a corpse, spices, impurities, heat, or age created a localized reaction, the miracle question narrows. The cloth may be unusual without being miraculous. The difficulty is shape. Those chamber strips yellow broadly, according to exposure. The shroud image carries gradations that preserve facial relief and body density, while remaining faint and shallow. A natural aging reaction can explain color. But can it explain why image intensity can be processed into three-dimensional information without producing the edge distortions expected from direct contact? The workshop print still hangs there misshapen, refusing to leave the comparison. That is where the burst light apparatus becomes relevant. In the dark room, a linen sample mounted before a high-energy flash shows only a thin surface discoloration on exposed threads. Superficiality again. The same prized feature that seemed to separate the shroud from art now appears in an engineered test environment. If a brief energy event can mark only the outermost fibrils, then surface only no longer belongs exclusively to miracle claims. Yet, the apparatus solves one problem by opening three more. The exposed sample is small. The coloration is local. The energy required for a full human image over an entire cloth rises into estimates that strain practical reconstruction. And even if such a burst could mark linen this way, what event in a tomb would produce it? And why would it encode a coherent body image rather than random overexposure? A natural chemical process can color linen but struggles with image geometry. A burst model can mimic superficiality, but drifts toward mechanisms no one has observed in burial conditions. Pigment leaves particles. Contact leaves distortion. Chemistry leaves broad reaction fields. Radiation leaves a question larger than the cloth itself. So the investigation circles back to the same narrower question in a more demanding form. Not whether the image is impressive, but whether any known process can account for its physical behavior without borrowing the language of miracle before the measurements require it. The cloth remains older or younger by separate arguments. It remains venerated for separate reasons. Here, under magnification and controlled light, the issue is smaller and harder. If it performed a miracle, where is the mechanism? If it did not, why do the available mechanisms keep reproducing only one property at a time? The question sounds simple when the cloth is seen from the nave. It hangs high above the altar behind protective glass, pale and narrow, with the wound marks still visible at a distance. A crowd gathers below it anyway. Kneeling pilgrims do not come because laboratory charts proved anything. They come because the stains at the wrists, side, and feet resemble the injuries described in the Passion. And because centuries of display have taught generations to approach this linen as if holiness had already settled into it. If the cloth actually performed miracles, where would that appear? Not in the weave itself at first glance. The wall of monitors in the adjoining exhibit offers a colder inventory. Face scans, fiber close-ups, date ranges, weave diagrams. One panel isolates the image-bearing threads. Another lists disputed chronology. Another compares blood pattern geometry with crucifixion trauma. The arrangement suggests a manageable answer. Perhaps the cloth's power is devotional rather than physical. It moved people, organized ritual, drew prayer, and acquired sacred force through repetition. That would explain the cathedral crowds without requiring the linen to do anything measurable on its own. Then the records become awkward. In storage, sealed binders and sample photographs sit beside devotional images of the crucified Christ, and the categories refuse to stay separate. Reports of cures and answered prayers cluster around public exhibitions, but they are not tied to repeatable effects from the cloth itself. No instrument reading spikes. No preserved section of linen shows a property that can be isolated, transferred, or reproduced. Yet the image still resists ordinary classification. If the cloth's influence is only borrowed from belief, why has this particular object held attention so stubbornly when so many relics faded into local piety? The image keeps reopening that question. It is not only that the wounds look scripturally appropriate, it is that the body image remains physically troublesome. The coloration sits on surface fibrils. The face in photographs sharpens in a way the naked eye does not anticipate. Some image density studies produce relief-like information. Those features do not demonstrate miracle, but they interfere with the easier explanation that the cloth became famous merely because people wanted it to be sacred. A revered object can attract stories. It does not automatically acquire an image that laboratories still struggle to model. So perhaps the miracle claim belongs not to later healings, but to the image's origin itself. That seems, for a moment, to gather the loose pieces. Crucifixion, consistent traces, no settled image mechanism, enduring veneration. But the monitors keep another pressure in view. Date ranges remain contested. Provenance remains contested. Public history thickens in medieval Europe, while earlier documentation stays thin. A miraculous imprint tied directly to Jesus would be expected to arrive with a cleaner chain of custody than this one. And still the opposite verdict does not settle in. The binders contain no final fraud closure either. No consensus says the cloth itself worked miracles. No consensus says it did not become sacred through contact with an event beyond ordinary explanation. The cathedral preserves it as an object of devotion. The charts preserve it as an unresolved material problem. Between those two conditions, the same linen continues to do something undeniable. Not healing on command, not proof on demand, but the more durable work of keeping both belief and doubt from finishing the case.